Lisa?" The words cracked through the silence of the pack hall, echoing off the ancient stone. Alpha Marcus's voice wasn't cruel, just utterly, devastatingly indifferent. He didn't even look up from the alliance treaty he was signing. "A frail thing like you? No. The moon goddess made a mistake. I, Marcus of the Silver Pine, reject you as my mate." Lisa felt the bond snap, a physical tearing in her chest that stole her breath. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at the man she was supposed to rule beside, realizing her entire life had been a lie. Then, the heavy oak doors of the hall blasted open, the scent of a storm and old blood preceding the man who stepped through. The whispering stopped. Even Marcus paled. The Lycan King had arrived. The silence in the grand hall of the Silver Pine Pack was absolute, broken only by the scratching of Marcus's pen against parchment. Hundreds of wolves stood at attention, witnessing the formal rejection. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The mating ceremony was meant to be a celebration, a cementing of power. Instead, it was an execution of Lisa's future. She stood before the dais, her ceremonial white dress feeling suddenly like a shroud. She was 20, barely into her adulthood, and known more for her quiet diligence in the pack's archives than her combat skills. The rumors had always whispered that she was too soft, too human, for a pack as aggressive as Silver Pine. Marcus finally looked up. His eyes, the color of winter frost, met hers. There was no apology in them. He was a pragmatic leader. He needed a warrior queen, a Luna who could command respect on the battlefield, not one who spent her days cataloging ancient pack histories. "The rejection is recorded," the pack elder intoned, his voice trembling slightly. He struck a heavy wooden gavel against the stone block. The sound was a death knell. Lisa felt the severing of the mate bond like a physical blow. It wasn't just a mental connection snapping. It was a tearing of the soul, a sudden, horrifying emptiness where a vibrant, warm presence should have been. She staggered back, her hand flying to her chest. She forced herself to remain standing. She would not give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here. Not in front of everyone who had always doubted her. The whispers began almost immediately, a venomous hiss spreading through the crowd. "Told you she wasn't strong enough. Marcus needs a real wolf, not a librarian. What will she do now? An unmated, rejected wolf is nothing." Lisa's gaze swept over the crowd. She saw pity in some eyes, but mostly she saw calculation. She was a liability now. She was an Omega in all but name. Before Marcus could dismiss her, before she could turn and walk out into the cold night to face a life of exile or servitude, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a gradual change. It was instantaneous. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent that made every wolf in the room instinctively bare their throats. A scent of ozone, damp earth, and overwhelming ancient power. The massive oak doors at the end of the hall didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that cracked the stone frame. The guards stationed outside were nowhere to be seen. Through the doorway stepped a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. He was tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and dressed in simple, dark clothing that nonetheless spoke of wealth and authority. But it was his presence that stopped the breath in Lisa's lungs. It was an oppressive, suffocating aura of dominance that commanded absolute submission. This wasn't just an alpha. This was David, the Lycan King, a myth to most, a terrifying reality to the few who had ever encountered him. He ruled the ancient lands to the north, territories that regular wolves dared not tread. He hadn't been seen in the southern packs, in centuries. The entire hall dropped to one knee. Even Marcus, the proud alpha of Silver Pine, hesitated only a fraction of a second before bowing his head. The silence returned, thicker and more terrifying than before. King David walked down the center aisle. He moved with a predatory grace, his footsteps making no sound on the stone floor. He didn't look at the bowing wolves. He didn't look at Marcus. His eyes, a startling, luminous amber, were fixed entirely on Lisa. He stopped mere inches from her. Up close, the sheer scale of him was overwhelming. He smelled of rain and something wild and dangerous. Lisa, her chest still burning from the severed bond, found herself unable to look away from those amber eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the terrified pack around them. Then David reached out. His hand, scarred and powerful, gently cupped her chin, tilting her face up. His touch was shockingly warm, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. A jolt entirely different from the mate bond she had just lost. "They said you were weak." David's voice was a low rumble that vibrated in Lisa's chest. It wasn't a question. He finally looked past her, his gaze locking onto Marcus, who was still kneeling, his face pale with a mixture of fear and confusion. "You are a fool, Alpha Marcus," David said, the words echoing with lethal quiet. "You rejected the only thing of true value in your entire territory." David turned back to Lisa. The intensity in his eyes was almost unbearable. He didn't shout. He didn't make a grand proclamation. He spoke quietly, intimately, yet his words carried to every corner of the frozen hall. "Mine." The word hung in the air, a single syllable that shattered the reality of everyone present. Mine. It wasn't a claim of ownership like a piece of property. It was an ancient, primal acknowledgement. It was a claiming. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his alpha pride warring with the instinctual terror of the Lycan king. "Your Majesty," he stammered, recovering a sliver of his composure. "There must be a mistake. I just rejected her. She is—" David didn't even turn his head. He merely shifted his gaze, the amber eyes hardening into something resembling molten gold. The air pressure in the room increased so drastically that several weaker wolves whimpered and pressed themselves flat against the floor. "Are you questioning the pull of the blood, Marcus?" David's voice was barely a whisper, yet it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the alpha of Silver Pine. Marcus swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw working. "No, my king, but she has no rank. She is a scholar, not a warrior." A low, humorless chuckle vibrated in David's chest. He looked back down at Lisa, who was still frozen in shock. "Rank is a construct of the weak," David said softly, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Power is inherent. You just didn't know what you were looking at." Lisa's mind was spinning. The pain of the rejection was still a jagged wound, but it was being rapidly eclipsed by a confusing, terrifying warmth blooming where David touched her. This was wrong. Lycans didn't take regular wolves as mates. It was unheard of. It defied every law of their kind. "I don't understand," she breathed, the words slipping out before she could stop them. David's expression softened marginally, an expression that seemed entirely alien on his harsh features. "You will," he promised. He dropped his hand from her face and turned to address the silent, kneeling pack. "Lisa of the Silver Pine is under my protection. She travels with me to the north. The decree was absolute. There was no room for debate, no space for Marcus to argue pack politics or ancient treaties. The Lycan king had spoken. "Wait," Marcus said, panic finally breaking through his deference. "You can't just take her. She was my responsibility. There are protocols." David moved so fast, it was a blur. 1 second he was standing beside Lisa. The next, he had Marcus pinned against the stone wall of the dais, his massive hand wrapped around the alpha's throat. The guards surged forward instinctively, but a single warning growl from David froze them in their tracks. It was a sound that didn't belong in a civilized hall. It was the sound of an apex predator promising violence. "Do not speak to me of protocols, little alpha," David hissed, his face inches from Marcus's. "You discarded her. You severed the bond. You have no claim, no responsibility, and no right to speak her name." He released Marcus, letting the alpha slide down the wall, gasping for air. David turned back to Lisa, offering his hand. "Come." It wasn't a request. Lisa looked at his hand, then back at Marcus, who was clutching his throat, his eyes wide with fear and a dawning realization of what he had lost. She looked at the faces of her pack, the people who had whispered about her, doubted her, and watched her be publicly humiliated. There was nothing left for her here. She placed her hand in David's. His grip was firm, reassuring, and terrifyingly strong. As they walked down the aisle, the sea of wolves parted, giving them a wide berth. No one spoke. No one moved. They were witnessing a legend rewriting the rules of their world. They stepped out of the heavy oak doors into the cool night air. A massive black SUV idled on the gravel drive, flanked by 2 more vehicles. 4 men, all impossibly large and exuding the same dangerous aura as David, stood by the cars. His royal guard. One of them opened the rear door of the SUV. David gestured for Lisa to get in. As she slid onto the leather seat, she looked back at the imposing stone structure of the Silver Pine pack house. It had been her home, her prison, and the site of her greatest humiliation. Now, it was just a building fading into the darkness. David slid in beside her, the door closing with a solid thud. The engine roared to life. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down on her. She was alone with the Lycan king, heading into territories no southern wolf ever returned from. David looked at her, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim interior light. "Home," he said simply. The SUV surged forward, leaving the only life Lisa had ever known in the dust. The severed bond in her chest still ached, but beneath it, something new was beginning to stir. A terrifying, intoxicating pull toward the man sitting beside her. The journey north was a silent marathon through dense forests and increasingly rugged terrain. Lisa sat rigidly by the window, watching the familiar pines give way to ancient, towering redwoods and jagged, snow-capped peaks. The SUV ate up the miles, the silence inside the cabin thick with unspoken questions. David didn't initiate conversation. He spent hours reviewing documents on a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Occasionally, he would glance at her, those amber eyes unreadable. It was unnerving. He had claimed her in front of her entire pack, defied their alpha, and taken her away, yet now he seemed entirely focused on pack logistics. By the second day, the silence became unbearable. The ache of the severed bond had dulled to a persistent throb, replaced by a gnawing anxiety about her future. She was a scholar, a chronicler of pack histories. She knew the legends of the northern Lycans, Brutal, isolationist, ruled by strength and blood alone. What place did a rejected, weak wolf have among them? Why me? The question slipped out, a whisper in the quiet hum of the engine. David didn't look up from his tablet immediately. When he did, his expression was thoughtful, devoid of the terrifying intensity he had shown in the Silver Pine Hall. "You think I chose you on a whim," he stated, rather than asked. "Lycans don't mate with regular wolves," Lisa countered, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. It's in the texts. The bloodlines don't mix." David set the tablet aside. He turned to fully face her, and the sheer physical presence of him seemed to shrink the space inside the SUV. "The texts you read are written by southern wolves who fear what they don't understand," he said quietly. "They write histories that flatter their own weakness." He leaned closer, and Lisa instinctively pressed herself against the car door. He smelled of pine needles and that distinct ozone scent. "I didn't choose you, Lisa. The blood chose you." The moment Marcus severed that bond, I felt it. The resonance. Lisa frowned. "Resonance? A Lycan doesn't have a destined mate in the way your kind does," David explained, his voice low. "We don't rely on the moon goddess to point a finger. We feel a resonance, a matching frequency in the soul. It's rare. Many Lycans live centuries without ever feeling it." He looked away, staring out at the passing, snow-dusted trees. "I felt it the moment that fool broke your bond. It was like a beacon flaring in the dark." Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs. He wasn't claiming her for politics or out of pity. He was claiming her because he believed she was his true equal in some fundamental, soul-deep way. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. "But I'm not a warrior," she said, her voice small. "I can't fight. I can't lead a pack of Lycans." David's gaze snapped back to hers. "Who told you that leadership is only about violence?" "Marcus," she replied without thinking. "And the elders. A Luna must be strong enough to defend the pack." "Strength has many forms," David said dismissively. "Marcus is strong like a blunt instrument. Useful, but ultimately limited. You survived his rejection without breaking. You stood in that hall, your soul tearing apart, and you didn't shed a tear. That is a strength most of my warriors don't possess." The convoy began a steep ascent, the road winding perilously close to the edge of deep ravines. The air outside grew noticeably colder, the trees sparse and twisted by harsh winds. "We are approaching the border," David announced, his posture stiffening slightly. "The Northern Territories." Lisa looked out the window. There was no physical barrier, no fence or guard post, but she felt the shift. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with an ancient, untamed energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. The SUV crested a ridge, and the world opened up below them. Nestled in a massive, glacial valley was a city unlike anything Lisa had ever imagined. It wasn't a collection of rustic pack houses. It was a fortress of stone and glass, built seamlessly into the mountainside. Waterfalls cascaded from the peaks, powering enormous, glowing mechanisms that seemed to pulse with energy. This was no primitive pack. This was an empire. "Welcome to Ethelgard," David said softly. As the convoy descended into the valley, Lisa noticed the people. They weren't just wolves. They were massive, muscular figures going about their business. They stopped and bowed deeply as the vehicles passed, their faces reflecting absolute reverence for their king. The SUV pulled to a halt before a massive, iron-reinforced keep at the center of the city. David stepped out and offered his hand again. This time, Lisa didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, bracing herself for whatever came next. As she stepped out, a tall, imposing woman with scars crisscrossing her face approached them. She wore dark leather armor and carried a curved blade at her hip. She bowed to David, but her eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on Lisa. "My king," the woman said, her voice harsh and raspy. "The council is waiting and—" She paused, her gaze lingering on Lisa with undeniable hostility. "They are not pleased." "They will wait," David replied, his voice flat, completely unbothered by the woman's tone. "General Rika, ensure our guest is shown to her quarters in the East Wing, the High Suites." Rika's jaw tightened. "The High Suites, sire? Those are reserved for—" "I know who they are reserved for, Rika," David interrupted, the amber in his eyes flaring briefly. The subtle shift in his aura was enough to make the scarred warrior take a half-step back, bowing her head in submission. "As you command, my king," she gritted out. David turned back to Lisa. His touch, when he briefly brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, was startlingly gentle compared to the cold authority he had just displayed. "Rest. We will speak tonight." He didn't wait for her reply. Turning on his heel and striding toward the massive iron doors of the keep, his royal guard falling into step behind him, Lisa watched him go, feeling incredibly small and entirely out of her depth. The severing ache in her chest flared, a stark reminder of why she was here, in this frozen, hostile place. "Follow me," Rika snapped, turning sharply and marching toward a side entrance. Lisa scrambled to keep up. The interior of the keep was vast and intimidating, built of dark stone and lit by flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows. The air was cold and smelled of old wood and polished steel. They climbed several flights of winding stone stairs, Rika maintaining a punishing pace. "I don't know what trick you used to beguile the king, Southern Wolf," Rika said, not looking back. "But do not think you have secured a place here. The North is unforgiving, and the council will not tolerate a weakness masquerading as a Luna." Lisa gripped the stone railing, her legs burning. "I didn't beguile anyone," she managed to say, her breath hitching. "He chose to bring me here," Rika scoffed, a harsh sound echoing in the stairwell. "Lycans do not choose weak mates. We survive because we are strong. You smell of fear and heartbreak. You are a liability." They reached a heavy oak door bound in iron. Rika pushed it open, revealing a room that took Lisa's breath away. It was expansive, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and large windows overlooking the glacial valley. The furnishings were heavy, carved wood covered in thick furs, yet it possessed a stark, austere beauty. "Do not leave these rooms until summoned," Rika commanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked Lisa up and down. "And do not presume that his protection makes you untouchable. Accidents happen frequently in the keep." With that chilling warning, the general pulled the door shut. The lock clicked into place with heavy finality. Lisa stood in the center of the vast room, the silence pressing in on her. The adrenaline that had kept her moving since the rejection finally crashed. She sank onto the edge of the massive bed, her fingers burying into the thick furs. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, surrounded by wolves who despised her, claimed by a king whose motives she barely understood. The memory of Marcus's indifferent face floated in her mind, the cruel finality of his rejection tearing fresh at the wound in her soul. Tears, hot and sudden, finally spilled over her cheeks. She wept for the life she had lost, for the quiet future in the archives she would never have, and for the terrifying uncertainty of the path ahead. The summons didn't come until the sky outside her window had turned a bruised purple, the valley below twinkling with the lights of Ethelgard. A servant, a timid young woman who kept her eyes averted, unlocked the door and instructed Lisa to follow. She was led not to a grand dining hall, but to a circular chamber deep within the keep. The air here was heavy with tension and the smell of ozone and old blood. In the center of the room sat a massive round table carved from a single slab of black obsidian. Seated around it were 8 figures, men and women, all radiating that same suffocating aura of dominance she had felt from David. These were the Lycan elders, the ruling council of the North. David sat at the head of the table. He looked up as she entered, his amber eyes locking onto hers. He didn't smile, but the crushing weight in the room seemed to lessen slightly under his gaze. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the empty chair to his immediate right. Lisa felt the hostile glares of the council members burning into her skin as she took her seat. The chair, carved from the same black stone, was cold and unyielding. An older man across the table, his face heavily lined and his left eye clouded with a milky cataract, leaned forward. He didn't bother hiding his disdain. "You bring a southern reject to our high table, David," the elder rasped, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. "You claim a resonance, a myth our ancestors discarded centuries ago, to justify bringing this fragility into our stronghold." David didn't raise his voice. He leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the table. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, before he spoke. "You question my judgment, Elder Torin?" The words were quiet, but they held the sharp edge of a blade. Torin didn't flinch. "I question your logic, my king. The southern packs are weak. They rely on the moon goddess and mating ceremonies. We rely on strength. What value does a rejected, unshifted scholar bring to the north?" A woman to Torin's left, her hair shaved close to her scalp, scoffed. She couldn't even hold the attention of a southern alpha. How was she to stand beside the Lycan king? Lisa gripped the edges of her seat, her knuckles turning white. They were talking about her as if she were a defective piece of meat. The urge to shrink, to apologize for her presence, was overwhelming. It was the instinct she had learned at Silver Pine, to make herself small and invisible to avoid conflict. She looked at David. He was watching her, waiting, not interceding. He was letting them tear her down. The realization hit her like physical blow. He wasn't going to fight this battle for her. He had claimed her, brought her here, but he wouldn't hold her hand against the council. He wanted to see if she would break. The lingering pain of Marcus's rejection flared, hot and sharp, but this time it wasn't followed by despair. It was followed by a sudden, fierce anger. She was tired of being a liability, tired of being told she wasn't enough. Lisa forced her hands to release the chair. She sat up straighter, forcing herself to meet the milky gaze of Elder Torin. "I may not have the strength of a Lycan warrior, Elder Torin," Lisa said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart hammered violently against her ribs. "But I have the knowledge of every treaty, every war, and every bloodline of the Southern Pacts for the last 400 years. I know their weaknesses, their alliances, and the quiet feuds they hide behind their diplomatic smiles." She shifted her gaze to the shaved-headed woman. "Alpha Marcus didn't reject me because I am weak. He rejected me because he is a coward who fears intelligence more than he values brute force. He needs a warrior because he doesn't know how to lead with his mind. The room went dead silent. The blatant disrespect toward a Southern alpha, coming from a rejected wolf, was shocking enough. But her direct challenge to the elders was unthinkable. Torin's good eye widened slightly. The woman beside him let out a low, dangerous growl, her fingernails lengthening into dark, curved claws against the obsidian table. "You dare speak of leadership in this chamber, little wolf?" the woman hissed. Before she could rise, the air pressure in the room spiked dramatically. The low hum of power that constantly radiated from David suddenly flared into a terrifying, suffocating force. It didn't push outward. It drew everything in, a black hole of pure dominance. The growl died in the woman's throat. Torin slumped slightly in his chair. Every Lycan at the table was suddenly rigidly still, their primal instincts screaming at them to submit. David slowly stood up. He didn't look at the council. His eyes remained fixed on Lisa. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "She does not need to hold the attention of a Southern alpha, elder," David said, his voice echoing in the silent chamber, vibrating with that terrifying power. "Because she has mine." He turned to the council, the smile vanishing, replaced by cold, absolute authority. "And Lisa stays. She is under my protection and my instruction. If any of you—" He paused, letting his gaze sweep over each elder, making sure they understood the implicit threat. "Have an issue with my decision, you may challenge me for the crown now. Otherwise, the matter is closed." The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. The elders exchanged tense glances, the primal hierarchy of their kind warring with their political objections. But the sheer, oppressive weight of David's power was undeniable. No one was foolish enough to challenge the Lycan king in his own stronghold. One by one, the elders lowered their heads, a reluctant gesture of submission. "Very well, my king," Torin rasped, though the hostility in his remaining eye hadn't faded. David turned back to Lisa, offering his hand. "Come, the council is dismissed." As they left the chamber, Lisa could feel the burning gazes of the elders on her back. She had survived the first trial, but she had made powerful enemies in the process. "You provoked them," David said quietly as they walked back through the torchlit corridors. It wasn't a reprimand. It sounded almost like an observation. "They were going to tear me apart anyway," Lisa replied, her voice trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. I was tired of being the silent victim." David stopped and looked down at her. The terrifying aura had receded, replaced by that confusing, intense warmth. "You surprised them," he said. "They expected a cowering scholar. You showed them teeth." He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw again. "We will need those teeth, Lisa. The North does not respect silence." The following weeks fell into a grueling, isolated routine. Lisa rarely saw David. He was consumed by the endless demands of ruling the Lycan territories. The threat of border skirmishes with rogue packs and the constant internal politics of the elders kept him away for days at a time. She was left to the vast, intimidating solitude of her suite, guarded relentlessly by General Rika's chosen sentries. They didn't speak to her. They merely ensured she didn't wander into restricted areas. The hostility wasn't just from the council. It seeped from the very walls of the keep. The servants avoided her eyes. The warriors sneered when she passed. She was an anomaly, a southern weakling thrust into the heart of northern power. To escape the suffocating silence, Lisa sought out the only place she felt competent: the archives. Located deep in the foundations of the keep The Ethelgard archives were a sprawling labyrinth of stone shelves, filled with ancient scrolls, bound leather tomes, and crumbling parchment. It was colder and darker than the library at Silver Pine, but the smell of old paper and dust was a comforting familiarity. It was here, surrounded by history, that she found her purpose. The Lycan records were chaotic, organized by bloodline rather than chronology, making it nearly impossible to trace broader historical events. Lisa threw herself into the work, spending 12 hours a day meticulously cataloging, cross-referencing, and translating ancient texts written in a crude, nearly forgotten dialect of their language. It was demanding work, a distraction from the dull ache of the severed bond and the terrifying reality of her situation. It also provided a crucial buffer against the hostility of the keep. Even Rika's guards couldn't find a reason to object to her sitting quietly in a dusty basement. One evening, deep into her second month at Ethelgard, Lisa found a series of journals bound in cracked black dragon scale leather. They were hidden behind a false panel in one of the oldest sections of the archives. The writing was frantic, filled with strange symbols and references to an ancient pact between the first Lycan king and an entity referred to only as the Shadow. She was translating a particularly difficult passage when a shadow fell across her desk. She jumped, her hand instinctively grabbing a heavy brass paperweight. It wasn't a guard. It was David. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and he smelled faintly of blood and exertion. He hadn't been in the keep for 5 days, dealing with an uprising in the eastern mountains. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, looking at her, then down at the mountain of organized scrolls and the translated texts spread across the table. "You been busy?" he finally said, his voice rough. Lisa lowered the paperweight, her heart thumping. It needed doing. The records were a mess. It's difficult to learn from history if you can't find it. David walked around the desk and picked up one of her translated pages. He read it in silence, his brow furrowing. "You translated this? The dialect of the First Age?" "It's similar to the old Southern runes," Lisa explained, feeling a strange flush of pride at his surprised tone. "Just more aggressive in its syntax?" David set the paper down and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in weeks. "The elders say you hide down here because you fear the keep. I hide down here because the keep hates me," Lisa corrected bluntly. "And because this is where I am useful. I can't wield a sword, but I can ensure your history isn't lost to rot." A small, genuine smile touched his lips, transforming his harsh features. "You are more dangerous with a pen than Rika is with a blade, I think." He reached out and gently touched the cracked leather of the hidden journals. "Where did you find these?" "Behind a loose stone in the third alcove," Lisa said, watching him closely. "They speak of a pact. The Shadow. The translation is difficult, but it implies the Lycan bloodline didn't originate from the moon goddess, but from a bargain." David's hand stilled. The warmth in the room vanished, replaced instantly by that terrifying, heavy silence. His amber eyes hardened, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "You will not speak of these journals to anyone," he commanded, his voice a lethal whisper. "You will not translate another word of them until I say so. Do you understand?" Lisa swallowed hard, the sudden shift in his demeanor terrifying. "Yes. But why? It's history." "It is not history," David said, his voice tight. "It is poison. A secret that the council would use to burn this entire kingdom to the ground if they knew it still existed." He took the black journals, tucking them under his arm. He looked at her, the harshness fading slightly, replaced by something entirely different. A stark, unguarded vulnerability. There are things in the North, Lisa, that are older and darker than the myths. Things that the resonance in your soul brought you here to help me face. He stepped closer, the distance between them vanishing. He smelled of cold air and danger, and something uniquely him that made her pulse race. "I need you to trust me," he said quietly, "even when you don't understand." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked out of the archives, leaving Lisa alone with a new, terrifying mystery. And the undeniable realization that the Lycan king wasn't just ruling a kingdom, he was guarding a secret that could destroy them all. The days following David's confiscation of the black journals were agonizingly tense. The air in Ethelgard felt heavier, the biting wind whistling through the stone corridors, carrying an unspoken threat. Lisa returned to the archives daily, but the sanctuary had lost its comforting warmth. It now felt like a tomb where secrets were buried alive. Determined not to be paralyzed by fear, she shifted her focus from ancient myths to contemporary logistics. If the keep despised her, she would learn how the keep functioned. She began cross-referencing supply chain manifests, guard rotations, and provincial tax records, the mundane lifeblood of the Lycan kingdom. It was a tedious, mind-numbing task. But on the 5th day, her meticulous nature caught a glaring discrepancy. She was huddled under the flickering light of a single oil lamp, running her finger down a thick ledger detailing troop movements in the eastern mountains. David had mentioned an uprising there, the reason he had been exhausted and covered in blood. But the ledger told a different story. 2 weeks before the uprising, 3 heavily armed battalions of the King's Vanguard had been quietly reassigned from the eastern border to the southern glacial plains. They hadn't been moved for a threat. They had been moved for a training exercise. Lisa frowned, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She checked the authorization seal at the bottom of the page. It wasn't the royal crest of the king. It was the jagged, 3-clawed sigil of Elder Torin. Torin had deliberately weakened the eastern border just before the rogue uprising. He had engineered the conflict that nearly cost David his life. "You dig entirely too deep for a southern stray," a voice rasped from the darkness beyond her lamp's reach. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly closed the heavy ledger, her hands trembling slightly, before turning to face the shadows. Elder Torin stepped into the dim light. His milky eye caught the lamplight, making it look like a dead pearl. Flanking him were 2 Lycans Lisa had never seen before. Massive, scarred men who wore no royal insignia, their eyes feral and fixed on her with predatory intent. They weren't palace guards. They were mercenaries. "Elder Torin." Lisa kept her voice carefully neutral, though her mind was racing, calculating the distance to the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs. It was too far. "I am merely doing the work the archivist neglected. You are a plague." Torin sneered, taking a step closer. The smell of wet fur and sour breath filled the small alcove. David's mind is clouded by this supposed resonance. He brings a weak, unshifted human into our stronghold, and now you sit in the dark, deciphering things that do not concern you. "Treason concerns the king," Lisa said, her voice steadying as anger flared, pushing back her fear. She placed her hand flat on the ledger. "You pulled the vanguard from the east. You let the rogues breach the perimeter. You wanted David dead." Torin's good eye narrowed, a flash of genuine surprise crossing his lined face. Then he laughed, a grating sound. You are smarter than you look. But intelligence without strength is a fatal combination in the North. The king will not survive another decade if he continues to soften. I am merely excising a weakness before it infects the whole pack. He gestured lazily to the mercenaries. It is a tragedy how poorly maintained these lower levels are. A structural collapse. A tragic accident for the king's new pet. The two mercenaries lunged forward, their fingernails instantly elongating into thick, deadly claws. Lisa didn't scream. Her mind, honed by years of studying battle tactics she could never physically execute, snapped into terrifying clarity. She grabbed the heavy brass oil lamp and hurled it directly at the face of the first mercenary. The glass shattered, splashing burning oil across the man's eyes. He roared in agony, his hands flying to his face as he staggered backward, crashing into a towering shelf of ancient, dusty scrolls. The second mercenary didn't even pause. He swiped his massive arm, backhanding Lisa with a force that lifted her off her feet. She crashed hard into a wooden reading desk, the breath leaving her lungs in a violent rush. Pain exploded in her ribs, blinding and sharp. She gasped, tasting copper, and scrambled backward as the mercenary loomed over her, raising a clawed hand for the killing blow. "Hold!" The command cracked through the archives like a whip. General Rika stepped from the stairwell, her curved blade already drawn and gleaming in the dim light. Torin spun around, his expression twisting with rage. "General Rika, you are interrupting a matter of state security. Stand down." Rika's scarred face was unreadable. She looked at Torin, then at the mercenaries, and finally at Lisa, who was clutching her side on the floor. "My orders from the king were explicit, Elder," Rika said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, guttural growl. "She is not to be harmed." "I am a member of the Council of Fangs," Torin bellowed. "I order you to step aside, or you will hang for treason alongside her." Rika didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Lisa with kindness, but she looked at Torin with absolute disdain. "My loyalty is to the crown, old man, not to the shadows." With terrifying speed, Rika closed the distance. The uninjured mercenary roared and met her charge. The archive erupted into a chaotic blur of violence. The sickening sound of blades biting into flesh and heavy bodies slamming into ancient stone. The fight was brutal but brief. General Rika was a legend in the North for a reason. Within seconds, the mercenary lay dead on the stone floor. His throat opened. Rika stood over him, breathing heavily, a deep slash across her leather armor, leaking dark blood. But her eyes were fixed on Torin. The elder took a trembling step back, looking from the dead mercenary to the one still writhing on the floor with burned eyes. "You have made a grave mistake, Rika," Torin hissed. Before Rika could reply, the temperature in the archives plummeted. The remaining oil lamps flickered violently, their flames turning a sickly, pale blue. The very air grew thick, pressing down on them with a suffocating gravitational force. Lisa, still clutching her bruised ribs against the desk, felt the breath leave her lungs all over again. It wasn't the physical blow this time. It was an overwhelming, primal terror. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Slow, heavy, David descended into the archives. He wasn't just angry. He was completely subsumed by a rage so profound it seemed to warp the space around him. The amber of his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, bottomless black that leaked a faint, smoky residue into the air. Tendrils of actual shadow seemed to peel away from the walls, drawn toward him like iron filings to a magnet. The shadow. The entity from the black journals. Lisa realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't a myth, and it wasn't a separate being. It was inside him. David didn't look at Rika. He didn't look at Lisa. He locked onto Torin. "My king," Torin stammered, the bravado evaporating instantly. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling. "I found them. These rogues, they were attacking the girl." David didn't speak. He raised a single hand. Invisible force slammed into Torin, lifting the elder off his knees and pinning him against the stone wall 3 feet in the air. Torin gagged, clawing frantically at his own throat as if an invisible hand were crushing his windpipe. The darkness around David thickened, swirling violently. The low hum of power in the room escalated into a deafening roar. He was going to kill Torin. He was going to rip the elder apart, and the sheer brutality of it was going to shatter the delicate political peace of the entire Northern Kingdom. David. Lisa didn't know where the strength came from. The pain in her ribs was blinding, but she forced herself up. She stumbled forward, ignoring Rika's warning shout. She reached the king and grabbed his forearm. The moment her skin touched his, the roar in the room stuttered. The shadowy tendrils whipping around him snapped back. Lisa felt a jolt of pure, freezing energy shoot up her arm, a sensation of ancient, ravenous hunger. It tried to consume her fear, to feed on her panic. But instead, she pushed back. She pushed her calm, her steady, stubborn will into that void. Resonance. David flinched violently, as if struck by lightning. The pitch-black color drained from his eyes, leaving the familiar, piercing amber. He gasped for air, staggering slightly. The invisible hold on Torin vanished. The elder crumpled to the stone floor, coughing and gagging, desperately sucking in air. David looked down at Lisa's hand on his arm, his chest heaving. The terrifying, oppressive aura receded, leaving behind a cold, damp silence in the archives. "You," David whispered, his voice rough and utterly drained. He looked at her face, registering the developing bruise on her cheek and the way she held her side. A fresh wave of anger flared in his eyes. But this time, it was human. It was controlled. He gently stepped in front of her, shielding her from the room. He looked at Rika. "Secure the elder in the deep cells. Treason. If he speaks, cut out his tongue." "Yes, sire," Rika said, bowing deeply, her eyes betraying a profound relief. David turned back to Lisa. Without a word, he stooped and scooped her up into his arms. The sudden movement sent a spike of pain through her ribs, and she let out a sharp gasp, burying her face in his chest. He smelled of ozone, and, faintly, of blood. But beneath it all was that grounding, warm scent that was entirely his own. He carried her out of the archives, past the bewildered guards in the corridors, straight up to his private chambers in the highest tower of the keep. He laid her gently on the massive bed, pulling back the heavy furs. "I'm fine," Lisa managed to say, though her voice shook. "It's just my ribs." "You are not fine," David said, his jaw tight as he unfastened his heavy cloak and threw it aside. He sat on the edge of the bed, his large hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her and cause more pain. "You could have died. Why did you not stay in your quarters?" "Because I found something," Lisa said, grimacing as she adjusted her position. Torin engineered the Eastern Uprising. He moved the vanguard. "I found the ledger." David closed his eyes, dragging a hand down his face. "I suspected. But proof is dangerous in the North. It forces a hand I was not ready to play." He opened his eyes and looked at her. The vulnerability she had seen once before returning, magnified tenfold. When I felt your terror, when I realized you were in danger, the shadow almost took full control. The journals, Lisa breathed. It's not just a pact. It's a curse. The first king traded half his humanity for the power to conquer this harsh land, David admitted, his voice a low, heavy burden. Every Lycan king since has inherited the power and the madness that comes with it. The shadow demands violence. It demands blood. It is a constant war in the mind. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing the hair away from her bruised cheek. For decades, the only thing that kept me grounded was sheer will. But the moment I touched you in Silver Pine, the resonance, it was quiet. The shadow fell silent. His amber eyes searched hers, filled with a desperate intensity. You are the anchor, Lisa. Without you, I will become a monster the North will have to destroy. Lisa stared at him, the weight of his words settling over her. She wasn't just a political pawn or a strange anomaly. She was the key to his sanity, and by extension, the survival of the entire kingdom. The severed bond with Marcus felt like a distant, irrelevant memory compared to the profound, terrifying connection tying her to this legendary king. Before she could speak, before she could process the magnitude of what he had confessed, a sound shattered the quiet intimacy of the room. It was a horn, a long, mournful blast that echoed off the glacial mountains, vibrating through the stone floors of the keep. David stiffened, the warmth instantly vanishing from his face, replaced by the cold mask of the king. He stood up, walking swiftly to the massive window overlooking the valley. "What is it?" Lisa asked, trying to sit up. "The perimeter alarm," David said, his voice flat and deadly. He turned back to look at her, the amber in his eyes hardening. "A southern pack has breached the valley. Alpha Marcus has come to Ethelgard." The valley of Ethelgard, usually filled with the low hum of machinery and the distant roar of waterfalls, was deathly silent. The perimeter alarms had ceased their mournful wailing, leaving behind a heavy, expectant quiet that settled over the stone keep like a shroud. David stood on the balcony of his chambers, staring down at the glacial plains. Lisa stood a few paces behind him, her ribs aching with every breath, a heavy fur cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Below, a line of torches snaked through the mountain pass, a massive contingent of southern wolves. Alpha Marcus had not come alone. He had brought a coalition. He's brought the Silver Pine, the River Bend, and the Crimson Moon packs, David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't turn around. He believes he has the numbers to force a negotiation. Negotiation for what? Lisa asked, stepping closer to the balcony doors, shivering as the freezing wind whipped her hair. He rejected me. He has no claim. He doesn't want you, Lisa, David replied, finally turning to face her. The amber of his eyes was bright, a controlled inferno. He wants what you represent. You are a southern wolf sitting in the high chambers of Ethelgard. You are proof that the North is not impenetrable. If I keep you, he loses face in the south. If he takes you back, he proves he can challenge the Lycan King. And what if you give me back? She asked, the question tasting like ash in her mouth. David closed the distance between them in a single stride. He didn't touch her, mindful of her injuries, but his presence was a physical wall against the biting cold. I do not surrender what is mine, he stated, the words vibrating with absolute, unyielding finality. If they cross the river, I will drown them in it. He turned and strode out of the chambers. Lisa didn't hesitate. Ignoring the pain in her side, she followed him down the winding stone stairs into the heart of the keep. The great hall was a scene of controlled chaos. General Rika was barking orders, coordinating the defense of the lower gates. Heavily armored Lycans moved with terrifying efficiency, their massive forms casting long, distorted shadows in the torchlight. David didn't stop in the hall. He walked straight through the massive iron doors and out onto the broad stone plaza that overlooked the main bridge spanning the icy river below. The southern packs had halted at the far edge of the bridge. Hundreds of wolves, their eyes glowing in the darkness, stood in shifting, nervous formation. At their head stood Alpha Marcus, flanked by two other alphas. He looked imposing, his chest puffed out, trying to project a dominance he clearly didn't feel. David stepped to the edge of the plaza, looking down at the invading force. The sheer scale of the Lycan King, framed by the towering stone fortress, seemed to physically shrink the army below. Alpha Marcus. David's voice boomed across the gorge, carrying over the rushing water without him needing to shout. You are trespassing in sovereign territory. State your business, or I will consider this an act of war. Marcus stepped forward onto the stone bridge. His voice, when he spoke, sounded strained, lacking the deep resonance of the north. King David, we come seeking justice, not war, Marcus called out, though his posture remained rigid. You took a member of the Silver Pine Pack, a wolf who belongs to the south. We demand her return and reparations for the insult to our sovereignty. She was cast out. David's voice was cold, flat. You severed the bond. She has no pack, Alpha Marcus. Only the protection of the crown. She is a southern wolf, Marcus yelled, his composure slipping. You cannot simply take what you want. The treaties, David interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register that made the hairs on the back of Lisa's neck stand up, were written by cowards to protect themselves from the monsters of the north. Do not speak to me of paper shields when you stand before the beast. David stepped back from the edge of the plaza, out of sight of the southern army. He turned to Rika, who stood waiting, her hand resting on the hilt of her curved blade. They will not leave, David said, his amber eyes darkening. They are too proud and too foolish. Orders, sire? Rika asked, her voice tight with anticipation. David looked at Lisa, who was standing near the heavy iron doors, her face pale, but her expression determined. The shadow inside him was thrashing, demanding release, demanding the slaughter of the interlopers who dared threaten his territory and his mate. Open the gates, David commanded. Rika's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she nodded sharply. Let them cross the bridge? Let Marcus cross, David corrected. Alone. If he wants to challenge my claim, he can do it according to the old laws. Alpha to king. No armies. No treaties. Rika signaled the guards. The massive iron portcullis slowly ground upward, with a deafening screech of metal on stone. David stepped back to the edge of the plaza, his form illuminated by the torches. Alpha Marcus, David roared, the sound echoing off the mountains like a physical blow. You want justice? Come and take it. Cross the bridge alone. Face me in the proving circle. If you win, you take the girl and your pride. If you lose, your coalition leaves, and you forfeit your life. A murmur of shock rippled through the southern ranks. A challenge of single combat with the Lycan King was a death sentence. It was suicide. Marcus stood frozen on the bridge. He looked back at his coalition, at the faces of the alphas who had followed him, expecting a political victory. They were watching him, waiting. If he backed down now, he would lose all respect, all authority. He would be known as the Alpha who ran from the north. Slowly, visibly trembling, Marcus took a step forward, then another. He crossed the bridge alone, the heavy gates closing behind him with a final, ominous thud. The proving circle was an ancient amphitheater, carved directly into the bedrock behind the keep. The stone was stained dark with centuries of blood. Torches flared around the perimeter, casting dancing, erratic light over the small crowd that had gathered. The Council of Fang stood on a raised platform, their expressions grim and expectant. Lisa stood near the edge of the circle, flanked by two of Rika's guards. She watched Marcus step into the ring. The Southern Alpha looked small, terrified, his chest heaving as he tried to project an air of confidence that fooled no one. David entered from the opposite side. He hadn't bothered to remove his cloak or draw a weapon. He simply walked to the center of the circle and stopped, looking at Marcus with absolute, chilling indifference. "First blood?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking slightly. "To the death," David replied, the words a heavy stone dropping in the silent arena. Marcus roared, a desperate, frantic sound, and lunged. He shifted mid-leap, transforming into a massive, silver-furred wolf. His jaws snapped shut on empty air where David had been standing a fraction of a second before. David didn't shift. He moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed, dodging Marcus's frenzied attacks with minimal effort. He was playing with him, a predator toying with its prey before the kill. But Lisa saw something else. She saw the subtle darkening of the air around David. She saw the faint, smoky tendrils beginning to bleed from his skin, curling into the frigid air. The shadow was waking up. The violence of the combat, the proximity of the threat, was feeding the ancient entity bound to his bloodline. Marcus charged again, claws extended, aiming for David's throat. This time, David didn't dodge. He simply raised his hand. The silver wolf slammed into an invisible wall of force, yelping in pain as the impact shattered ribs. Marcus crumpled to the stone floor, sliding several feet before coming to a stop, struggling to rise. David stalked forward. The ambers in his eyes was entirely gone now, replaced by the terrifying, bottomless black. The air pressure in the amphitheater plummeted. The torches flickered and died, leaving only the pale moonlight to illuminate the slaughter. The elders on the platform murmured nervously, stepping back from the edge. They recognized the aura. They recognized the monster their king was becoming. David reached down and grabbed the massive silver wolf by the scruff of its neck, lifting it off the ground as easily as a pup. The dark tendrils wrapped around his arm, pulsing with a sick, eager energy. He wasn't going to just kill Marcus. He was going to tear him apart, to obliterate him in a display of primal savagery that would stain the stone and feed the shadow's endless hunger. "David." Lisa's voice cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the arena. She pushed past the guards, ignoring their shouts of warning, and stepped into the proving circle. David froze. The massive silver wolf dangled from his grip, whimpering softly. The king slowly turned his head to look at her. The black, empty eyes were terrifying, devoid of any humanity, any recognition. "He's gone," a voice in her head whispered. "The shadow has him." But Lisa remembered the feeling in the archives. She remembered the desperate vulnerability in his voice when he spoke of the curse. She refused to believe the man who had brought her here, who had protected her, was entirely lost. She walked toward him, ignoring the frantic, crushing pressure in the air, ignoring the pain flaring in her ribs with every step. "Lisa, get back!" Rika yelled from the perimeter. Lisa didn't stop. She stopped directly in front of the towering, terrifying figure of the Lycan king. She looked up into the black abyss of his eyes. "David?" she said softly. her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. The contact was electric. The freezing, ravenous energy of the shadow slammed into her, trying to consume her, to feed on the lingering fear she held for Marcus, the pain of her rejection. But Lisa didn't offer fear. She offered the quiet, stubborn resilience she had built in the archives of Silver Pine. She offered the knowledge that strength wasn't just about violence. She offered the absolute certainty that he was not a monster. Resonance. It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, agonizing tug of war. The dark tendrils whipped around her, scoring shallow cuts across her cheeks and arms. But she didn't flinch. She held her ground, anchoring him to the present, to the reality of her touch. Slowly, agonizingly, the oppressive weight in the air began to lift. The dark tendrils receded, shrinking back into David's skin. The pitch-black color drained from his eyes, the familiar, piercing amber fighting its way back to the surface. David gasped, a ragged, tearing sound, and dropped Marcus. The silver wolf hit the stone floor and didn't move, unconscious but breathing. David staggered backward, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. He looked at his hands, then at Marcus, and finally, at Lisa. The arena was dead silent. The elders stared in stunned disbelief. They had witnessed the shadow, the terrifying myth they whispered about in the dark. And they had witnessed a fragile, unshifted human drag their king back from the brink of it. David closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. When he opened them, the cold, lethal composure of the king had returned. But his gaze, when it rested on Lisa, was incredibly soft. He turned to address the silent crowd. "The challenge is concluded," David announced, his voice carrying effortlessly. "Alpha Marcus lives. He will be returned to his coalition at dawn. They will leave the Northern Territories immediately. If they return, there will be no challenge. There will only be slaughter." He looked up at the Council of Fangs. Elder Torin was glaring down at him, but there was a new emotion in his milky eye. Fear. "Lisa of the Silver Pine," David said, his voice dropping slightly, meant only for her and those closest to the circle, "is no longer a guest. She is the Luna of Ethelgard. Her word is my word. Her safety is the kingdom's safety." He didn't ask for the council's approval. He didn't wait for a response. He walked over to Lisa, gently wrapping his arm around her uninjured side, supporting her weight. "Come," he said quietly. "Let's go home." As they walked out of the amphitheater, leaving the stunned council and the broken Alpha behind, Lisa leaned into him. The severed bond in her chest was completely silent, replaced entirely by the profound, terrifying, and fiercely protective warmth of the Lycan King. She had come to the north as a rejected outcast, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Now, she was the anchor of an empire, the only thing standing between a legendary king and the darkness within him. Lisa's journey from a rejected, overlooked scholar to the Luna of the most formidable Lycan kingdom was a testament that true strength isn't always measured in fangs and claws. It's found in resilience, intelligence, and the courage to stand your ground when the world tells you to submit. King David found his equal not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, unyielding spirit of the woman the South threw away. Thank you for reading this dramatic tale of power, hidden history, and unexpected love. If you enjoyed The Alpha Rejected Me, then the legendary Lycan King chose me instead.